Welcome back to the Paranormal State, Washington, and UFO UAP. With Makāula Nakae, a lifelong experiencer and ET contactee since 1990. Today's episode, 1953 MK Ultra. The Mind Control Rabbit Hole when MK Ultra 1953 to 1973 met the UFO phenomenon. If the story of government UFO investigations involves a mix of baffled generals, radar ghosts, and high-tech digital servers, the intersection of MK Ultra introduces a far more unsettling psychological element. It forces us to ask a terrifying question. How much of the high strangeness we experience is coming from the stars, and how much is being beamed straight into our skulls by our own government? While Project MK Ultra was officially a sprawling, clandestine CIA mind control and behavioral modification program that ran from 1953 to 1973, it has become inextricably linked to the modern UFO abduction narrative in the public imagination. Here is the deep dive into the shadowy overlap between government psychological warfare and the alien abduction experience. To truly understand how a black-budget government mind control program like MK Ultra bled into the collective consciousness of modern ufology, you have to look closely at the men who built the machine and the genuine panic that drove them. The program wasn't born out of casual scientific curiosity. It was forged in the absolute paranoia of the early Cold War, a moment when the American intelligence establishment genuinely believed the free world was losing an invisible psychological arms race. The psychological trigger for MK Ultra can be traced directly to the aftermath of the Korean War 1950 to 1953. When American prisoners of war, POWs, were repatriated from North Korean and Chinese prison camps, military psychiatrists and intelligence officers were deeply unsettled by what they saw. Several returned American soldiers publicly praised communism, renounced the United States, and most alarmingly, signed confessions claiming the U.S. military had used illegal biological weapons during the conflict. To the CIA, these public conversions could not simply be dismissed as the result of physical torture or standard maltreatment. The intelligence community convinced themselves that communist adversaries had unlocked a revolutionary scientific method, dubbed mentation control or brainwashing, capable of chemically and psychologically restructuring a human brain, turning loyal soldiers into programmable, obedient assets who could be sent back across enemy lines as sleeper agents. Faced with the terrifying prospect of a psychological Sputnik moment where the Soviets controlled human behavior, CIA Director Allen Dulles authorized the creation of a countermeasure with virtually no moral or legal guardrails. That countermeasure became MK Ultra. If Allen Dulles provided the institutional permission slip, Dr. Sidney Gottlieb provided the twisted scientific drive. As the head of the CIA's Technical Services Division, TSD, Gottlieb was an unassuming, club-footed chemist who possessed a chilling appetite for radical experimentation. In the corridors of Langley, he was known as the Black Sorcerer, or the CIA's resident poisoner. Gottlieb believed that human consciousness was nothing more than biological software, and that if you applied the right chemical, electrical, or psychological sledgehammer, you could wipe, rewrite, or fracture that software at will. At the operational heart of the CIA's dark biological and chemical empire sat the Technical Services Staff, TSS, and presiding over it with chilling scientific detachment was Dr. Sidney Gottlieb. Often referred to by historians and former colleagues as the CIA's Black Sorcerer, Dirty Trickster, or Chief Poisoner, Gottlieb was a complex and paradoxical figure. Born Joseph Davidovich to Orthodox Jewish immigrant parents in the Bronx, Gottlieb earned a Ph.D. in biochemistry from the California Institute of Technology, Caltech. Despite walking with a pronounced limp due to a childhood accident and speaking with a stutter, he possessed a brilliant razor-sharp intellect and an absolute lack of conventional moral boundaries. When the Cold War escalated, Gottlieb channeled his genius into engineering the most insidious chemical and neurological weapons the intelligence world had ever seen. Under Gottlieb's absolute operational control, the TSS became the ultimate incubator for state's ancient horror, driving the expansion of MK Ultra and its specialized divisions. The Chemistry Division, TSSCD. Under Gottlieb's direct guidance, this division was tasked with manufacturing, procuring, and testing lethal poisons, exotic biological agents, synthetic hallucinogens, and disabling chemicals. Gottlieb personally oversaw the stockpiling of lethal toxins, including botulinum toxin, anthrax, and shellfish saxitoxin, intended for covert assassinations of foreign leaders like Fidel Castro and Patrice Lumumba. Gottlieb bypassed traditional bureaucratic hurdles by funneling CIA funds through front organizations like the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology. This allowed him to secretly contract elite researchers, psychiatrists, and pharmacologists at over 80 prestigious universities, maximum security prisons, and pharmaceutical labs across the United States and Canada. Unwitting academic scientists were given blank checks to test the limits of behavior modification, radiation, electroshock, and psychotropic drugs on human subjects. Gottlieb operated under a veil of total operational security and deniability. Because TSS answered only to the highest echelons of the CIA directorate, Gottlieb could authorize reckless, highly dangerous human experiments, such as slipping massive doses of LSD into the drinks of unsuspecting civilians in safe houses during Operation Midnight Climax, without fear of oversight, ethics boards, or criminal prosecution. Sidney Gottlieb transformed the technical services staff into a deadly nexus where academic science merged with the dark arts of espionage. By treating human biology and consciousness as mere variables in a chemistry equation, Gottlieb and the TSS pushed the American intelligence apparatus to the absolute edge of inhumanity in the name of national security. Under Gottlieb's direct supervision, MKUltra expanded into a sprawling network of sub-projects farmed out to universities, hospitals, and prisons across the United States and Canada. Because standard federal oversight would have choked the program in red tape, Gottlieb funneled money through front organizations like the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology, ensuring the researchers had complete deniability and total legal immunity. To find a way to control human behavior, Gottlieb and his network of doctors subjected unwitting citizens, prisoners, psychiatric patients, and even CIA operatives to a horrific array of human experiments. These methodologies were divided into distinct psychological torture tracks. The CIA famously set up safe houses in San Francisco and New York, hiring sex workers to lure unwitting men into the apartments, where agents surreptitiously slipped massive doses of LSD into their drinks while watching through two-way mirrors to study the behavioral effects. Gottlieb didn't stop at psychedelics. He funded the research and stockpiling of BZ, an incapacitating agent that causes severe delirium, memory loss, and hallucinations, barbiturates, and synthetic cannabinoids, searching for the ultimate truth serum or memory erasure drug. The program heavily explored how the human mind shatters when stripped of its sensory anchor points. Subjects were placed in pitch-black, soundproof isolation tanks filled with warm water, eliminating sight, sound, and touch. Researchers subjected individuals to days of continuous, deafening white noise or repetitive instructional audio loops designed to break down ego boundaries and make the psyche hypersuggestible to external commands. Perhaps the most damaging work funded by MKUltra, pioneered in places like the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal by Dr. Ewan Cameron, focused on depatterning. Cameron believed he could cure mental illness and program individuals by completely erasing a patient's memory using massive repeated doses of electroshock therapy, combined with drug-induced comas lasting weeks. While patients were trapped in these artificially induced comas, speakers were placed under their pillows playing repetitive audio loops for 16 hours a day. The goal was to completely shatter the existing personality, reducing the human mind to a blank slate that could then be rebuilt from scratch. When the scandals broke in the 1970s and director Richard Helms ordered the bulk of MKUltra files shredded in 1973, the public discovered that the federal government had spent 2 decades treating its own citizens as laboratory rats in pursuit of absolute control over the human mind. This dark historical reality is precisely why MKUltra remains so inextricably linked to the UFO phenomenon in the popular imagination. When an agency is proven to have experimented with hallucinogens, sensory deprivation, memory implantation, and psychological masking on a mass scale, it creates a deeply unsettling paradigm shift. It leaves humanity staring across a very blurry line, wondering where government-engineered psychological warfare ends and genuine high-strangeness contact begins. When the program was exposed by the Church Committee in the mid-1970s, the CIA frantically ordered files destroyed. But the fragments that survived painted a picture of an agency that treated human consciousness as a laboratory instrument to be hacked, rewritten, and manipulated at will. Given the dystopian nature of MKUltra, investigators and alternative researchers quickly began drawing a dark parallel between the CIA's behavioral experiments and the classic UFO abduction narrative that exploded in popularity during the exact same decades, the 1960s and 1970s. Some researchers have hypothesized that certain civilian abduction experiences, particularly those involving missing time, surgical extraction of implants, paralyzing beams of light, and intense psychological disorientation, weren't extraterrestrial at all. Instead, they are theorized to be the byproduct of illegal domestic human experimentation. Under this dark lens, secret military, our intelligence contractors, use civilian populations as guinea pigs for advanced psychotronic weapons, aerosolized hallucinogens, or electromagnetic mind control tech, using the alien abduction framework as the ultimate, built-in cover story. If a subject wakes up remembering a terrifying medical examination by gray-skinned beings in a glowing room, local authorities and psychiatrists are far more likely to write them off as eccentric than to investigate a black-budget CIA program. A more nuanced, widely accepted psychological overlap centers on how human memory handles extreme trauma and altered states. MKUltra researchers prove that under the influence of powerful dissociative drugs, like LSD, or extreme psychological trauma, the human brain enters a hypersuggestible state where false memories can be systematically implanted and perception of time and space can be fundamentally warped. Critics and skeptics of the traditional abduction movement point out that many iconic abduction stories, such as the 1961 Betty and Barney Hill case, were extracted or shaped using hypnotic regression. Because hypnosis is notoriously unreliable and prone to confabulation, where the brain fills in blanks with cultural tropes, researchers argue that the modern alien abduction narrative is essentially a psychological mirror. It takes the deep-seated Cold War anxieties of the era, forced experimentation, loss of bodily autonomy, alien technologies, and wraps them in a sci-fi mythology. The intersection of MKUltra and ufology represents the ultimate rabbit hole because it forces the witness and the researcher into an impossible dilemma. If you lean into the extraterrestrial hypothesis, you have to contend with a universe filled with an intelligence that interacts with human consciousness, manipulates time, and leaves psychological scars. If you lean into the MKUltra hypothesis, you are forced to confront an even more cynical reality: that your own government was willing to systematically break human minds, weaponize perception, and use the specter of alien visitors as a smokescreen for terrestrial tyranny. Ultimately, whether the abductors stepping out of the glowing craft are visitors from another star system or black-budget scientists operating out of a dark room at Fort Detrick, the result on human consciousness is identical. Both realities prove that our perception of objective reality is fragile, easily hacked, and fiercely guarded by gatekeepers who prefer to keep us in the dark. When we look back at Project MKUltra from the perspective of today, it is easy to view it as a relic of a darker, more paranoid mid-century era, a closed chapter of Cold War madness involving secret safe houses, naive university researchers, and Sidney Gottlieb dosing unwitting citizens with LSD. Yet, the legacy of MKUltra is not merely a matter of dusty archival files and historical postmortems. It casts a long, unsettling shadow over the modern intelligence landscape, forcing us to confront how government manipulation of human perception has evolved. The evolution of the battleground, from chemistry to cognition. The fundamental objective of MKUltra was never just about testing drugs or breaking human psyches for the sake of cruelty. Its core aim was cognitive dominance, learning how to control information, manipulate human behavior at scale, and shape what populations perceive as real. While the heavy-handed physical methods of the 1950s, such as electroshock and clandestine LSD dosing, were exposed and legally shuttered, the underlying quest for psychological control simply mutated into the digital age. The modern intelligence apparatus no longer needs physical safe houses to alter behavior. Today, cognitive warfare and gray zone operations utilize targeted data streams, algorithm-driven information bubbles, and large-scale psychological profiling to influence collective perception. The battlefield has shifted from the human nervous system to the digital screen. The ongoing congressional scrutiny and declassification battles surrounding intelligence overreach prove that the fear of hidden government programs is as potent today as it was decades ago. When oversight committees unseal historical files or debate the limits of deep state secrecy, the ghost of MKUltra remains the yardstick by which institutional honesty is measured. This is precisely why MKUltra remains eternally linked to the UFO and paranormal phenomenon in the public imagination. When an intelligence agency proves through its own declassified records that it spent decades experimenting with false memories, sensory disorientation, and the artificial construction of reality, it shatters public trust. It creates a permanent, lingering doubt in the minds of witnesses and researchers. When anomalous experiences occur, where does objective reality end and psychological conditioning begin? Whether looking at the high strangeness of the Cold War skies or the high-tech digital walls of modern intelligence compartments, the core lesson remains unchanged. The most fragile battleground on Earth is not physical territory, it is human consciousness. And whoever holds the keys to perception controls the definition of reality itself. Strictly speaking, history does not record a single very first victim of Project MKUltra, because the CIA's mind control program did not begin in a vacuum on day one, with a single test subject. Instead, MKUltra, officially authorized by CIA Director Allen Dulles on April 13, 1953, was the direct continuation and expansion of earlier, overlapping intelligence programs like Project Bluebird, launched in 1950, and Project Artichoke, launched in 1951. These earlier projects were already conducting clandestine human experiments involving unwitting subjects, hypnosis, truth serums, and early chemical interrogation in secret overseas prisons and domestic facilities. However, looking at the broader architecture of the program and its infamous sub-projects, a few individuals stand out as the earliest or most prominent primary test subjects. The early unwitting foreign subjects, 1951. Declassified documents and historical investigations, such as those detailed by researcher Stephen Kinzer and Poizner in chief, indicate that as early as 1951, under Project Artichoke, CIA chemist Sidney Gottlieb and his team traveled to places like Tokyo, where they secretly administered depressants, stimulants, and experimental chemicals to individuals suspected of working for foreign intelligence before executing them. Harold Blower, 1953, often cited as one of the first documented American citizens to die directly as a result of the military intelligence chemical testing programs that fed into MKUltra. Blower was a professional tennis player, voluntarily seeking treatment for depression at the New York Psychiatric Institute in January 1953. Without his knowledge, Army chemical warfare researchers injected him with massive experimental doses of a synthetic mescaline derivative. He suffered a violent reaction and died on the table. The military spent decades covering up his involvement. Dr. Frank Olson, 1953. While not the very first person experimented on, Olson is arguably the most famous early casualty of MKUltra's operational testing phase. CIA biological weapons researcher, Olson was unwittingly slipped a dose of LSD by his superiors during a secluded retreat in November 1953. Plunged into a severe psychological crisis, he was brought to New York City for supposed psychiatric help and subsequently died after falling or being pushed from a 10-story hotel window. The victims of Dr. Ewan Cameron, 1950s to 1960s. Under MKUltra Subproject 68, the CIA funded psychiatrist Dr. Ewan Cameron at the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal. Cameron subjected dozens of vulnerable patients who came seeking help for postpartum depression, anxiety, or neuroses to brutal depatterning experiments, which included weeks of drug-induced comas, massive electroshock therapy, and repeated audio loop brainwashing. Because the CIA systematically destroyed the vast majority of MKUltra financial and operational records in 1973, under the orders of CIA Director Richard Helms. The identities of hundreds of the earliest unwitting test subjects, particularly marginalized individuals, prisoners, and psychiatric patients, remain lost to history. If you ask a dyed-in-the-wool ufologist about the inner workings of government cover-ups, they will likely point you toward crashed disks, reverse-engineered propulsion, and deep underground bunkers. But if you look at the actual historical paper trail left behind by the Cold War intelligence apparatus, you realize something profoundly disappointing. The government wasn't river engineering alien technology. They were just high on experimental acid, heavily sleep-deprived, and aggressively trying to figure out how to mind-wipe a guy named Gary from accounting. To understand the strange, looping collision between Project MK Ultra, secret aviation, and modern ufology, you have to separate what the universe was doing from what Dr. Sidney Gottlieb was doing in a basement laboratory, with a beaker of glowing pink liquid and zero adult supervision. Let's be entirely clear about one fundamental truth. True extraterrestrial intelligence does not need a CIA budget, case of Sandoz brand LSD, or a rusty pair of electrodes to manipulate human consciousness. An advanced non-human intelligence crossing the cosmic void is not paging through Dr. Sidney Gottlieb's dog-eared manual on chemical interrogation, wondering how to induce a panic attack. Humans, however, humans love that stuff. Long before anyone was drafting internet theories about government alien hybrid programs, the U.S. military-industrial complex was already busy trying to hack the human nervous system, all on its own. It started in 1950 with Project Bluebird, graduated to the aggressive pharmaceutical binge of Project Artichoke, and finally exploded into the glorious bureaucratic nightmare known as MK Ultra. Under the absolute operational control of Gottlieb, the agency's resident black sorcerer and chief poisoner, the technical services staff treated human free will like a software glitch that needed patching. They wanted absolute interrogation control, total memory erasure, and most terrifyingly, the ability to program a normal human being to commit high-stakes espionage or assassination before forgetting they ever owned a passport. Meanwhile, while Gottlieb and his mobile interrogation squads were running wild in overseas black sites slipping secret hallucinogens to unwitting souls, the skies above America were filling up with genuinely weird stuff. The U.S. military was furiously test-flying radical new hardware, like disc-shaped experimental prototypes and high-altitude spy planes. When everyday citizens and civilian pilots looked up and saw a glowing silver saucer tearing across the horizon at impossible angles, they didn't think, yes, that's just John Frost's tabletop VDOL disaster coming home from the wind tunnel. They thought, space invaders. And here is where history gets delightfully messy. Whenever a citizen reported a high-strangeness encounter involving missing time, altered states, paralysis, and bizarre medical examinations, ufologists tended to look upward. But intelligence agencies quickly realized that the public panic surrounding flying saucers made for an exceptionally convenient smokescreen. Why admit your top-secret black-budget aviation project crashed in a desert when you can just let people assume it was a weather balloon or a visiting delegation from Zeta Reticuli? More darkly, some researchers note that the psychological trauma inflicted on unwitting human subjects during Cold War, black-budget drug trials often produced terrifying, surreal hallucinations of non-human entities and medical abduction. When you pump a human being full of synthetic mescaline, lock them in a sensory deprivation tank, and blast hypnotic audio loops into their headphones, the resulting psychological breakdown looks remarkably like a close encounter of the third kind, minus the actual alien. So, when we look at the intersection of modern ufology and the dark legacy of MK Ultra, we are forced to draw a sharp line. Genuine anomalous contact operates on a level of physics and consciousness that leaves human pharmacology looking like a toddler playing with a chemistry set. But the methods used to study, conceal, and sometimes simulate those high-strangeness experiences are soaked in the bureaucratic paranoia of the 1950s. Ultimately, the flying saucer didn't give us mind control, and Project Silverbug didn't give us free anti-gravity. But together they proved a timeless, slightly cynical truth about human nature. Whenever we encounter something we don't understand, whether it's a craft streaking across the stars or the infinite, terrifying complexity of the human mind, our first instinct is to build a secret bunker. Slap a classified stamp on it and see if we can turn it into a weapon. To be continued. Watch and listen. Watch the cinematic video trailer. Listen to the full podcast now. Explore the archived Cosmic Awakening Volume 1, 1991, Peru, Journey into the Unknown. Sacred Valley of the Incas. Volume 2, Ascension 2012, The Golden Alchemy. Part 3. The First Contact and the Paranormal State. Join the journey. New episodes drop periodically. Each chapter delivers a tight, hyper-focused 10 to 30-minute exploration into the evolution of ufology, perfect for your daily plunge into decoding hidden messages from outer space, designed to raise awareness and foster human evolution. Subscribe to support your inner development. Thumbs up to help push our channel through the algorithm. Comment below. Do you think the psychological trauma reported by ufology witnesses is evidence of otherworldly contact or the lingering shadow of Cold War mind control programs?